The Iguana. Recently, I read an ancient poem about an iguana. It reminded me of my cousin. It was a long time ago, and I had almost completely forgotten her until then. The anacham flower is said to be so delicate that when you smell it once, it is supposed to wither away. Sarah's Aka's heart was like that flower, tender and soft. She could not bear to witness suffering or sadness of the slightest kind. Stray puppies flocked to her waiting arms. She gave beggars generous portions of grain and later faced the wrath of her mother. Her only trait to match her kindness was her stubbornness. No one could ever persuade her to change her stance on an issue once her mind was made up. She held on to her ideas and ideals with a grip like that of the proverbial iguana, or udumbu. But a great transformation came over her when she fell in love. Though all the members of her family were non-vegetarians, Sarah's Aka stuck to vegetarian food. Nobody knew why she became a vegetarian, but she refused to yield to all the pressures her mother brought on her to convert her to meat-eating. She was like Sita among the ogresses of Ako Shabanam. I can't even recall her face now. All I can remember is her nose. It was pretty, as if it had been sculpted with expert hands. Her nostrils were so small that even an ant couldn't pass through. We were playing Kohan one day, a game played with small pebbles thrown up in the air and dexterously caught as they came down. No one could beat her at this game. She played it with the intensity of a professional. Sarasaka collected smooth pebbles from the seashore just for this purpose. During play, she would pick the stones off the floor by snapping them up briskly, one by one. When the pebbles were scattered, she gathered them all in her hand with an elaborate sweep from the elbow. It was my turn at the game. I had to throw a pebble as high as the roof and catch it in my cupped palm upturned. I accomplished it and shouted, "Ah, finally done," and looked for Aka, but she had vanished as if by magic. Sarah's Aka was incapable of running away without making a noise. Whenever we played hide-and-seek, her bangles and anklets always betrayed her. How had she managed to disappear so quietly, I wondered. I turned around to face the reason for Sarah's Aka's untimely disappearance. It was riding a bike. Singapore Machan was another cousin of mine. He had a new bike. The handlebar was decorated with 4 mirrors, and colored rings embellished the axles on the chain. He was making his entrance like a prince on horseback. Despite his name, he had no idea where Singapore was. His father, who had worked in Singapore, was receiving a pension from there. They had come back home, bought 4 lots of land, and started a money-lending business. They lived comfortably. The wealth thus accumulated had given Machan a movie star-like status. His most important job was to polish his bicycle day and night until his arms ached. After Sarasaka grew into a young woman, the bicycle began to make frequent trips in the direction of her house. Sarah Aka's magical vanishing act gave him the opportunity to have glimpses of her through the gaps in the door. She straightened the creases in her skirt and mended her necklace by chewing on it. As for Singapore Machan, he was busy discussing matters of great importance with Chinnama. Only his eyes kept flitting back and forth restlessly, as if watching a local tennis match. Chinnama was determined to somehow lure Singapore Machan for Saras Aka. She expected all the mothers of eligible girls in the village not to upset her plans. She fumed when they waited in the streets like wayside robbers for the arrival of Machan. Chinnama called them shameless whores every time they made attempts to waylay Machan. It was during those times that I learnt many beautiful, abusive words. On those occasions when Machan managed to escape from all those interfering mothers on the lane and make it to the house, Chinama would do all she could to entertain him. She laughed at all his jokes and even appeared to be yearning for the jokes that went untold. It repulsed me. In the villages, I knew that love was not something that had to be stoked every day. All you needed was just the right spark, and it grew of its own accord. Saras Aka's face started to take on one of those lovelorn looks, and I could see that her thoughts were miles away while she played Kohan with me. Her eyes were in constant search for things not around her, and there was a trace of newfound enthusiasm in her voice. She had started to sing love songs while sitting under her favorite mango tree in the yard. Yesterday at dusk, at the bathing pond. The happiness in her voice filled the entire house and beyond. Their love was thriving in quite a conventional way, although not a single word had passed between them. Kalki's serialized novel, Siva Kamanin Sapatham, had come out as a book, and Saras Aka was longing to read it. She begged me to speak to Machan about it. "You ask him," I said one day in desperation. "Why do you need me?" and pushed her right in front of him. As if scraping the rice off the bottom of the pot, she gathered all her courage and just barely managed to mumble the name of the book she wanted. Machan went looking for the book everywhere, like someone searching for the mythical Pardyardam flower. Finally, he found the book in a faraway village library and brought it to her. There followed requests for more books, an excuse to exchange breathless, excited words. On those days, it cannot be said for certain that they did not let their hands stray. Their fingers, in the urge to express themselves, often slipped out of their owner's control. The Nandiavartai tree nearby, moved by their expressions of love, looked the other way. Saras Aka's devotional instincts suddenly rose 10 degrees higher. She made frequent visits to the temple, decking her hair with jasmine flowers. She observed fasts and kept off various foods, even as she continued to live among meat-eaters. She shared with me the special sweet milk rice that she prepared at the end of her fasts. Saras Aka sat pure and pious like an angel in a world of her own. I sensed we were all waiting for something to happen. At that juncture, Cinema proposed a cunning plan to move their love forward by one more minor step. People from Singapore had different preferences when it came to eating. They were lovers of food and would gladly lay down their lives for iguana or udumbu curry. It was decided that Machan should be fed this delicacy. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been the belief in our village that those who ate udumbu curry once were sure to return to taste it again. There was a small problem with this plan. In our village, there was no shortage of iguanas, and our own grounds were full of them, but special training was necessary to catch them. Some days they got caught, and other days they went free. There was no guarantee that they would cooperate and be available on Friday to suit our plan of having an udumbu feast on Saturday. Saras Aka's father, my uncle, was a well-built but completely naive man. The entire business of running the house fell on Chinama. My uncle was happy to let her have this level of reign as long as there was no ban imposed on the chewing of tobacco, his addiction. Whenever a question was put to him, he would bestow a gift on the questioner by spitting right there in front of him before he gave a reply. My uncle had already spent 42 years of his life and was waiting, with more years in hand, to continue living. He walked with his hands outstretched, making way for himself through the air around. He liked to bathe at least 3 times a day, and was always seen at the wellhead, like an ancient yogi, spreading out his cloth like a flag. Some said that his baths were the reason for his body being in such good shape. The kumuku tree near the well had become smooth and healthy with his constant rubbing of his back on its bark. The villagers said that at one time he had been an expert at catching iguanas. Those who had learnt the art from him were known for their skill. But, after what he experienced one day, he left the iguanas alone. He was going about his work as usual when an iguana crossed his path, minding its own business. He could not let go of such an unsolicited opportunity, and immediately raised a small army of youngsters. The entire village surrounded the iguana and chased it. The helpless animal, in its flustered state, forgot its ability to climb trees, and hid inside an anthill. That was that. Now there was no doubt at all that the animal would be caught. My uncle was not in the habit of giving up on an exploit halfway through. Added to that was the prospect of eating udumbu curry. Uncle removed the upper cloth he always carried very conveniently on his person, and covered the hole. As expected, the cloth covering the hole moved, and my uncle sprang into action and began to haul it up. The end of the creature was nowhere in sight. Whatever was under the cloth stretched out long and unending. Someone with a little common sense shouted, "Careful, it's a snake!" My uncle reportedly took to his heels in his loincloth, and was found only after 2 days. Since my uncle could no longer be trusted, Kitnan was commissioned to catch the iguana. The contract was that he should catch an iguana for the Saturday feast. Kitnan was a master craftsman and got the job done with just a basket, 2 lengths of rope, and a staff. Catching the animal was easier than cooking it. First, it had to be skinned alive. This was the only way to effectively remove the poison from the animal. The second problem was that you had to make sure that the bones were removed from the meat. If a bone punctured your throat, you could end up dead. The third requirement was that the meat had to be added to the cooking pot as soon as it was cut. Realizing all these potential hazards, we discussed various strategies and kept ourselves in a state of alert. Kitnan hammered a nail 6 feet above the ground into the mango tree and tied a noose around the iguana and hung it alive on the nail like a calendar. As we were watching, he took a slender knife from his waist and peeled the skin off the animal like peeling a banana flower. The iguana cooperated with him fully in every aspect possible. Chinnama placed the pot on the fire in the kitchen and was ready. Sarasaka stood at the entrance, and I next to Kitnan. Kitnan cut the meat and placed it on a banana leaf. I ran with it to Sarasaka, and she gave it to Chinnama, who put it in the pot. Thanks to the assembly line we set up, the meat reached the pot unhindered. By the time I made my 4th trip, the iguana was dead as dead could be. The coconut, the chili, and the mixture of other condiments were already in the kitchen. There was a short discussion on whether the preparation should be served in sauce or dry fried. In the end, it was decided that it should be fried. As the meat began to cook, a smell infused the room. The stench churned our insides. Sarasaka ran out, holding on to her midriff, retching. Chinnama was the only person who stood her ground, covering her nose with the end of her sari while she cooked. Kitnan rolled up the iguana's skin and left with the promised 50-cent piece. Just then, Machan arrived, wearing a silk shirt that shone in the afternoon sun. His hair, which had been neatly kept in place with cart grease, looked as if it was plastered to his skull. Sarasa Ka, who had come to the front of the house by chance, stood gaping with unblinking eyes. Machan came from a family of means. Sarat Aka's family was of the lowest rung in the poorest part of the village. They spread the mat and entertained Machan as well as they could. They fanned him with a palm tree branch, and the service they rendered was comparable to that offered to great sages of the past. Chinnamma served the food, and Sarasa Ka stood watching through a gap in the door. I stood close by, keeping her company. There was another reason for my standing so close to her. A small piece of bone was stuck to the meat, and I waited to witness the disaster about to happen. Machan had 4 helpings. He ended the meal with rice and rasam, sucking up the rasam in a cupped hand. He got up to display the curry stains on his silk shirt as if they were medallions of valor. Finally, he opened his mouth to make the divine pronouncement of "Aha, aha," which translated to his complete satisfaction with the meal, and Sarasa Ka's heart must have thrilled to the highest point. The happiness lasted only until that evening. However secret the matter was kept, an old woman of the village got wind of the feast that Machan had been treated to, and came into the house and wailed, "Ediya, don't you know that Udumbu curry spoils relationships? You have brought utter ruin on yourself." She made the hair of the listeners stand on end with her stories of the ruin that Udumbu curry had wrought on people for no less than 2 generations. While mother and daughter sat there completely dumbfounded, the old woman left, tucking into her waist 4 sheaves of freshly plucked betel leaves. Chinnamma and Sarasa Ka were mortified. Machan's family was far above them in status. All Chinnamma wanted was for her daughter to marry well and into a family higher than theirs. She had acted without thinking of the consequences. Should she not have thought of this eventuality right from the start? The news of the feast reached Machan's father at the speed of 50 miles an hour. He was, at the time, discussing with his neighbor the merits of toddy, brewed at Kandamadam. On hearing the news, his anger caught like wildfire. His shouts, as they pushed the air through his missing front teeth, could be heard 10 houses away. He put his hand between his thighs and scratched himself hard and long and glared at the sky, his anger refusing to abate. The first 33 seconds after Machan's return went by calmly, without any incident. On the 34th second, the floodgates burst open, and his father jumped up and down like Panadai Panayaram frying in hot oil. He stomped on the ground, effectively scattering the chameleons sunning on the fence. When he came in with a branch from a kilawai tree to beat his son, the neighbors grappled with him and managed to stop him. Throughout the whole incident, Machan remained silent like a half-wit. The entire village was there, watching the scene, collectively forgetting even to breathe. Negotiations for marriage alliances for Machan began right away. Many bride viewings were arranged daily for him. Every day, at least 4 or 5 people came to Chinnamma to report on the happenings at Machan's house, as if they had been exclusively engaged as informants. Chinnamma looked at Sarasa Ka with hostility, and Sarasa Ka began to observe even more rigorous penances. For a while, everyone pretended nothing had happened. Many weeks passed. Sarasa Ka was falling apart. She spent all her time watching the entrance to her house. Her face withered like the stem of greens left in the sun. Sarasa Ka, with her delicate sensibility like that of the anacham flower, was wasting away now, having lost her heart to an umdumbu eater. However close I was to her, it was not possible for me to gauge what went on in the inner recesses of her heart. Machan's engagement was announced, and after that the Sarasa Ka I knew ceased to exist. There were no more songs, pranks, or waiting near the gate. She even lost to me when we played kokan. The rope that had been used for the iguana still hung from the nail on the mango tree. Sarasa Ka and I sat on our respective stone seats and talked about many things. We debated about the pet tortoises that we raised in our well. We made noises by beating on tin drums to save the mangoes from the squirrels whenever we heard them scrambling. Sarasa Ka loved the legend of Aso Kalama, a low-caste woman for whom the king was willing to give up his throne, and told me the story over and over again. I opened my mouth many times on those occasions to ask her about Machan, but could never quite bring myself to do it. She began to sing softly. Yesterday, at dusk, at the bathing pond, coming closer, he signaled. Who could he be? She repeated the song, her eyes glistening, and when she reached the last line, her voice broke. It was the feast day at the Aman temple, and everyone was at the festival, but I stayed back, on duty with Sarasa Ka. Moonlight touched the branches of the mango tree. After placing the oil lamp in the veranda's niche, we stood there, looking up, watching the fireworks from the temple. Whenever a fire pod went up in the air and burst into showers, Sarasa Ka's face lit up and brightened for a minute. We had never felt that close to each other. On that entrancing night, her face looked both sad and beautiful. An iguana slithered past us, and I thought a better opportunity would never arise again. I decided to ask Sarasa Ka what I had wanted to for so long. Machan should not have done this to you. My heart beat like the second hand of a clock. I had, for the first time, put my feelings into words. What does it matter? At least the iguanas are spared, and perhaps this is a blessing for them. So saying, she laughed a soundless laugh. There was no trace of regret in her voice, only relief.